Hello and welcome to another Sunday masterclass video. So I've got some paint swatches here, and in this week's video I thought I'd show you how I have evolved how I make paint swatches over the years and the way that I do them now. So this is how I started out, and I would swatch my colours here so we can see that I've got the names here of both the manufacturer and the colour, and I swatched them sort of quite dark. If I take this one out so you can see, I swatched them quite dark and then added varying amounts of water so that we get the lightest to the darkest. There's nothing wrong with doing this at all. This is a quite effective way of swatching. So your simplest way of swatching would be just to swatch the colour with sort of a medium amount of water. This takes it up another step, and you can see that I've swatched the yellows together. So this worked quite well. And I swatched my primary colours like this, because when I started painting I only actually had primary colours. Then I started getting some secondary colours, so I swatched these. And I started moving away from the brand that I started with, which was Talens Rembrandt. By moving away, I don't mean that I stopped using them, because they're a fantastic brand, one of my favourites. But I started adding in colours from other brands. I added some SAA colours, I added some Winsor & Newton, and eventually I added some Daniel Smith. Now I've got some neutral colours here. So that was where I started. And then I started making swatches where I mixed colours together. So in other words, secondary swatches. So let me bring this one out here. And you can see them, I've got them in these cheap plastic wallets simply because it protects them. If you don't protect your swatches and you have them near you when you're working, you're going to end up getting splatters. What I did here was almost like a map reference. So down the side I had my pinks, across the top I had my blues, and then I would go across here, and we've got Talens Quinacridone Rose here, and I would take it across, and here I mixed it with Daniel Smith Manganese Blue. Here I mixed it with Ultramarine Blue. Let's go further down. Down here we've got a Talens Permanent Light Red, which is a very scarlet colour. So once we come to mix it with our blues, we're barely getting purples at all. We're getting these very muted colours. And this also is a great way of mixing together. And if you're a beginner particularly, this is very, very useful, because it allows you to get, not only just to see what colour you get, but to actually get an idea of the personality of the colours. For instance, this first row here, if we come down from the top, these are all cerulean blue, and you can see that they're all kind of soft colours, and they've all got granulation going on, in that you can see little speckles of the cerulean blue because it's a granulating colour. Here in the phthalo blue, we've got a transparent colour, so you see that all of these colours are quite transparent. And then, as I said, we can look at the properties of the colours that we mix with, and we get a combination of one and the other, just like these two had a baby, and they have some characteristics of each of the parents' colours here. So this is a great way of swatching as well. And as I said, I recommend this particularly if you're a beginner, and particularly if you have trouble visualising what your colours will look like. Now here I've got pretty much the same idea, but what happened of course was I bought new colours and I couldn't fit them in the first swatches I'd made, and they weren't neat enough for my slightly obsessive brain, so I made them a bit neater and I added in my new colours, because obviously at that time I imagined that I would never buy more colours than this. I had all the blues I wanted now. Oh, how foolish I was. But anyway, nice colour chart here, isn't it? I've got other types of colour charts here. I was asked to do a blog post for White Nights watercolours, so I just basically swatched out the colours I had so I could look at them. So we've got this simple colour chart here. I've got another secondary chart here, some greens. These are all slightly mixed up because I no longer use the exact method that I've got here. I then started working with Jackman's art materials, and I still work with them. So I had some of the initial colours they sent me here. And I can't find it at the moment, but somewhere in here I had sort of, I had a page that was just basically, you know, when you're working and you think, oh, I wonder what will happen if I mix cerulean with red ochre, and you get this really strange kind of greyish brown. Oh, that's an interesting colour. I would just swatch it and I would write down, you know, I mix this with this colour and this colour. So that also, as a beginner, that's a great thing to do as well, just making up random swatches of colour mixes that you weren't expecting. But in this video I'm going to show you how I make my swatches now and how I have evolved from this, because I now have a much better idea in my head of not only how colours look, but how they look when mixed together. So let's look at that next. So eventually what happened was I got fed up with making swatch charts, making all these colour charts, and then thinking, I don't need any more blue. Oh, I want that blue. And then adding in, and I've got no gaps. And so then I discovered online that what people were doing was they were using holders like this. Now these are, let's see if I can get it all on camera. This has sort of 4 pockets here, and I believe these are meant for something like trading cards, but you can get them in all sorts of sizes. So you can get them tiny ones, postage stamps, and you can get slightly larger ones than this for business cards. So whatever size you want your swatches to be, you can find these wallets to size, and then you just move them around and slot in new ones. Aha, I thought I found the perfect system. So then I needed to actually make the swatches that I wanted. And so rather than, you can actually buy online, you can buy watercolor paper that's already, got markings on. But I wanted to be able to use my own paper, because it's quite important that you use the paper that you regularly paint on in order that you can see all of the colors consistently as they will appear on your paper, because surface does make a difference to color. So let me show you these swatches next. Oh, and just as we do that, on the back here, in the back of the wallets, I've actually got some Brusho swatches. So you see, not all the swatches in your wallet have to be the same, in your folder have to be the same. You can add things in as you want. And of course, all of these pages lift out. So I've got these swatches here, but right at the back, I have got a stencil that I made. So what I decided to do was, I had to think about what I wanted on my swatches and what I wanted them to look at, and I made a stencil. So here's the stencil that I made. I just got some stencil card and I drew on it and cut out with a scalpel blade. And then I've got some papers in here that are ready cut to make a stencil. And I've also written the size here, which is 10 centimeters by 14. You can do yours any size you want. So now all I have to do is pop this over the top, and I can draw my guidelines in and get my stencil ready. Let me show you one I've already done, and then I'm going to show you how to paint one the same as I make mine. But as I said, you don't have to have them the same shape and size. You don't have to include the same things. I just want to give you options in this video. So here is a finished swatch. So what information have I got on these swatches? So firstly, I've got the color name. This is French Ultramarine. I've got the manufacturer's name. This one is by Jackman's Art Materials. In this top box, I've got what I would call a standard swatch that I make nowadays, rather than doing them in individual boxes, which can be quite hard to judge if you're going to get between the darkest to the lightest. I like to do them in one box like this, and so that I can really see the color. I can see how it looks when it's at its lightest, at its darkest. It'll also show me things like granulation. I'll be able to see the properties of the color. Don't worry, I'm going to show you how to paint this in a minute. Then I've got a box where I take the color pretty much as dark as it will go without losing fully the look of the color, and then I take it sort of as light as it would go. This space I've left down the side here is for pigment numbers. So this is a single pigment paint, PB, that's pigment blue 29. Now pigments do vary between brands. I have a longer video all about the properties of paint. I'll see if I can find that one and leave it in the video description for you. But with another pigment, we might have a mixed pigment. So there might be 3 or 4 pigments written down here if the manufacturer had mixed more than one pigment into their paint. Let's look at these bottom 2. This one here is an opacity test. So what I've done here is I've used some permanent black marker pen and I've drawn a bar in this one. And what this will enable me to do is, as I paint across with sort of a medium mix of paint, I'm going to see how clear this black line looks. It's kind of a medium, I would say, for this one. If the line appears to be very clear, just as clear as when I drew it, it's going to be a paint that's very clear and transparent. If it goes kind of milky and I can't see it as well, then that's a paint that has a lot of opacity. And finally here, I've done a lifting out test. So I've allowed the paint to dry and then I've lifted out. I'll show you how to do all of these things. As I said though, I don't want you to think you have to exactly copy my way of doing swatches. I'm just giving you options so that you can choose how to make your own swatches. So let's go forwards and make one of these. Okay, so let's make our sample. So I've been tracing around these. I realise they're not the neatest squares in the world. You could make this much neater if you wanted to, but I'm a complete neat freak and I'm quite happy with this. So I've done my little stencil here. What I'm going to do now is write the names on, and I'm going to do this before I put the paint on, because what I find is that if you mess up the writing, it's quite easy just to discard this and start again. If you've done all these beautiful paint samples and then you mess up the writing, it's it's a little bit annoying and you're thinking, oh, do I use the Tipp-Ex mouse or do I start again? So I'm going to swatch this colour today. So this is Perylene Violet by Winsor & Newton. It's a beautiful colour. And if I look on the back here, you probably can't see on camera, but it says Pigment PV, that's Pigment Violet 29. So this is a single pigment here, and I'll write the pigment number down here, as well as the name and the manufacturer, which of course you can shorten. Sometimes you might just put W and N for Winsor & Newton. Doesn't really matter, do it how you like. So I'm going to do that next. So next thing I'm going to do is just with a straight edge, draw down here and just make it a little bit wider. So this is a permanent liner pen. I never know how to say the name of this brand, Staedtler, I assume. Just want to make sure you're using a permanent black pen, making a line that's, you know, fairly thick, and we'll use this to test our opacity. So let's get started next on the painting. So remember, this is what we're going for. We're going to fade this top one out, and this top one is going to show granulation. Then we're going to go full strength, light as we can, and then we're going to test how that black line holds up and how opaque the pigment is. And then we're going to do the lifting out test. That will be done last because it needs to be done after the paint's dry. So let's start painting. So it's important we start over one side with clean water. If you try just to fade out an edge, it's not impossible to do, but in a small space like this with a strongly coloured paint, it's likely to go a bit wrong. So I'm going to start at the other end. I've taken that clean water about halfway across. You don't have to be too exact. I've got 2 jars of water on hand so that I can get completely clean water if I want it. I've also got some paper towel so that I will be able to dry my brush if I need to. That's quite strong, so I'm going to rinse and semi-dry my brush there, and let's just start to spread this so it hits the water. And now we just want to try and even out a little bit. So we've got this kind of mid-range colour here, rinsing and drying again. Because if we get puddles, what will happen is we'll end up with drying lines. So you don't want uneven drying. So at some point you may need to go back and just even everything out a little bit. Remember, these samples don't have to be perfect. You're just trying to see how the paint looks. And this fading here will allow you to see if there's any granulation. Do it quick, leave it alone, don't fiddle with it for too long. Don't reintroduce any wet paint to it, and don't allow there to be any puddles. Next, I want to do my sample that's quite dark. So I'm adding a little water because if it was just straight out of the tube, we wouldn't see probably much colour at all with this dark paint here. And this is a strongly pigmented colour. Some lighter colours like raw umber or cerulean simply won't go as dark as this, but this is okay. This is what we're testing for, to see how dark and how light a particular pigment goes. I want you to get away from the idea that any of these properties are good or bad. They just are what they are. So now I'm going to water this down with loads of water, and now we'll go for our lighter one. Be careful when painting this one because when you have very watery paint, there's less surface tension, so you're more likely to get some splatters happening. So now we've got a nice light sample as well. So I'm getting a real good idea of how this colour looks. Again, don't allow any puddles, otherwise you'll get uneven drying. But if you do, it's not the end of the world. So now what I want to mix is sort of mid-range. So I want the colour to be transparent enough that we can see through it, but strong enough that it will have some effect on the black lines. So I've mixed kind of mid-range now. So all I'm going to do is take this across here, and we'll instantly start to cover that line a little bit. As it dries, you'll start to see what happens. With a transparent colour, that black line will almost sort of reappear and be very, very sharp. With an opaque or semi-opaque colour, it will be covered to some extent. So this pigment at the moment, I'll need to let it dry, appears to have a little bit of opacity, but not too much. Again, get away from the idea that opaque paints are good or bad. They just exist and we can choose to use them in certain parts of our painting. There's nothing wrong with opaque pigments. It's all about choosing what's most appropriate for the use that you have in mind. And I'm going to do exactly the same again. I might go a little darker with this one. Now we're going to do our sample that will be lifted out. So this sample is all about how much stays on the paper. If it's a staining colour, it might be a lot. If it's a more granular colour, it might lift a little more. So what we're going to do here is we're going to apply this and allow it to dry. You need to let it get completely dry as well. I haven't done many steps today, so I'm going to go for a walk, and when I come back, I'll show you how we lift out to test this colour. So let's do our opacity test. The paint is dry. I've got a circular stencil here, but you don't need to use a stencil at all. You could equally put 2 strips of tape and leave a little gap in between, however you want to do it. I like to use this simply because it stops any paint spreading outside of the sample. I've got a cotton wool makeup remover pad here. Now, in the UK, they call these makeup remover. I've tried to find a US word for cotton wool, but it seems to be that you just call it cotton wadding in the States. Let me know in the comments. What I'm trying to say is this doesn't have anything on it. These are sold just as pure cotton. There's nothing else in there like any kind of makeup remover or anything like that. And I've put a little bit of water on it, but you want them honestly barely damp, because if it's at all wet, then the water will go underneath the stencil. And all we're going to do is just bunch it up and start making some circles. Now, the amount that you can lift out will depend on the pigment. It's also going to depend on how sturdy your paper is. So after a little bit of rubbing, you'll see the paper starts to degrade and, it starts to bead up and lift in places. And that's the point where you want to stop. So I'm going to lift this off now. Let's compare it to this ultramarine blue. I think the ultramarine blue lifted out a little more. There's not much in it, but it's going to complete your sample and give you a test result for how much of this paint roughly you can lift out once it's on. So let me know in the comments if you swatch your colours and what sort of method you like to use. Hopefully this video has given you some more ideas. And inadvertently, whilst swatching this Perylene Violet, I also did a fabric test here, and it doesn't seem to want to come out, which is just a sign from the heavens that I really shouldn't wear white or cream clothing. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for lots more watercolour pencil drawing and mixed media videos, and I'll see you in the next one.